오늘은 조금 특별한 주제를 이야기를 해볼까 합니다. 인터넷, 데이터 이코노미, 플랫폼 비즈니스 이런 얘기를 해보려고 하는데요. 그래서 진짜 특별한 분을 모셨습니다. 인터넷의 아버지다 라고 불리우는 분이기도 하고요. 구글의 부사장을 역임하고 계시는 분입니다. 빈튼 서프 박사와 함께 하겠습니다. Well, Dr. Cerf, you are widely known as one of the fathers of the internet. So having said that, could you please provide us a short history lecture on the internet?
안녕하세요. Thank you for asking about internet. I am only one of the fathers. There are many people who have contributed to it, including many people in your country. Kim Nam-chon, for example, if you don't know him, is kind of the father of the internet in Korea. The story goes way back to 1969, over 50 years ago. The Defense Department was funding research in computer science and artificial intelligence. Imagine that in the 1960s. They had about a dozen universities that were pursuing this research. Every year, each university would say, you have to buy us another world-class computer so we can do world-class research. Even ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, said we can't afford to buy a dozen computers every year. So we're going to build a network and you can share your computers. And everybody hated that idea, but they said we're going to build this network anyway. So it was designed to do resource sharing among different kinds of computers. The Defense Department decided that maybe computers could be used in command and control. Then they realized that if you were going to do that, some of the computers would be in mobile vehicles, some would be in ships at sea, and some would be in airplanes. My colleague, Robert Kahn, who was at ARPA at the time, started working on a mobile packet radio network and a packet satellite network, and of course the original ARPANET. Then he came to my office at Stanford and he said, well, we have a problem because we have these different kinds of networks and somehow we have to make them look uniform. How do we interconnect different kinds of nets? So that was the internet problem. How do I connect nets together? And the answer to that turned out to be a set of protocols that we call TCP/IP.
I have to ask you, when you and other researchers invented and developed all those systems, did you ever imagine that this thing will change the world completely?
You know, a simple answer would be no, but that wouldn't be exactly right. Now, remember that this starts, for me anyway, way back in 1969, that I was getting the history of the internet by a spoonful at a time, beginning to realize how powerful this technology was. I can tell you, even in the earliest stages of this work, we were experimenting with packetized voice communication and video communication. So we were already looking at and trying to design something which foreshadows today's use. We just couldn't do very much of it because the data rates were too low. But over time, as you well know, optical fiber technology has come along. The data rates are now 10 million times faster than they were. So we can support literally billions of people online.
So it kind of accelerated much faster rate than you guys have expected, I guess. It created a lot of opportunities and also big, huge market and also the companies like Google, So in your opinion, which company do you think is best serving the intention or envision of viewers?
Of course, as you know, that I work for Google, and so I'm probably very biased. You know, our motto is organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. I honestly believe that we still are trying to do that. I have to tell you a little story about this. The World Wide Web wasn't invented until late 1991 by Tim Berners-Lee. So up until that time, the internet was mostly a text-based system. When Tim invented the World Wide Web, and when Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina invented the Mosaic browser, which made a graphical user interface out of the internet. It stimulated people to want to share the information that they knew with other people, not because they wanted to make money, just because they wanted the satisfaction of knowing that something they knew was useful to someone else. So once the World Wide Web shows up, an avalanche of content is flowing into the network. But the thing that was critical is that there was so much information flowing into the net on the web pages, which is why we need needed search engines. And then Google comes along in 1998 and, of course, comes up with this interesting business model. Okay, if somebody is searching for something, we will simultaneously go and search our index of the World Wide Web, but we will also look in our big bag full of ads and put up ads that have something to do with what the person was searching for. And that turned out to be a very successful business model, which allowed Google to offer services free of charge to the users because it was paid for by the advertising.
How did you join Google? It was in 2005, I believe.
The short story is I was working for a company called WorldCom. WorldCom was badly managed and the company went bankrupt and we sold it to Verizon. And at that point, I had to decide, do I go with the company to Verizon or do I do something else? It happened that the CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, was an old friend. I'd known him for many years. And so I sent him an email and I said, "Hi, Eric, would you like some help?" So that was my job interview. And then when I joined the company, they asked me, "What title do you want? How about Archduke?" That sounds like a really great title. And they said, "You know, the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914, and it started World War I. Maybe that's a bad title. Why don't you be our chief internet evangelist?" And I said, "Okay, I could do that." So that's what I am now, Google's chief internet evangelist.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you didn't take the Archduke. That's a funny story. During the pandemic, we start to realize how important the internet is because a lot of companies made their employees work at home. It would have not been possible without internet. But at the same time, that we have to think about how secure the internet is. Because sometimes you have to deal with some confidential information that company doesn't really want to reveal. Can we trust the internet, the security system, and how safe is it?
First of all, it's not safe enough. At Google, we encourage people to use two-factor authentication, for example, but there's other things that use the hypertext transport protocol in secure mode. At Google, for example, in the Google Cloud, all the information that is in the cloud is encrypted while it's at rest on our disks. It's decrypted to be used, and then it's re-encrypted again on the disk. So if someone breaks into the system from outside, all they get is encrypted data. We use a variety of techniques in order to keep people's data safe and secure. And we offer computing services to lots and lots of different companies and individuals. Every one of them wants to be reassured that their data and their information is isolated. And so it's extremely important for our business to keep people isolated and keep their data protected. And there's another secret I should tell you. I learned very early in my career how easy it was to make a mistake and create a bug and how hard it was to find the bug. So we have a lot of software out there that has mistakes in it. And sometimes other people can find those mistakes to break in, to get access to information that you don't want them to have. So there's a long list of hazards that are potential. And you and I as users need to be aware of that and need to be thoughtful about what we're seeing and hearing and doing. So we try to teach people that they should think critically about the information that they're getting on the net so that they don't get fooled.
I see. As a political scientist, I'm very much interested in the data trading. President Biden and the administration is talking a lot about the data economy. As a matter of fact, we don't have a rule or global standard for that. So I wonder how it's going to evolve and how the US or other countries are going to write down the rules and the standards for the data trading.
This is an extremely perceptive question, and I'm glad to know that someone like you cares about this. So in the case of data protection, you will know, of course, that the European Union generated its general data protection regulations, and its intent is to give guidance to companies about protecting personal information that assure users that their information is safe. Speaking, from the corporate point of view, telling people how you protect the information, what information that you have and keep is very important. A lot of the discussion is about personal information, things like financial records and so on. But I need to tell you, there's a bigger concern that everyone should have, and that's all of the other information that we hold on your behalf, all the other material that you use our computing resources. That information is just as important to you. Second thing is that it's very important that information be transferred across international borders, that our data centers are scattered around the world deliberately. What that means is that we have to be able to send data back and forth between our data centers. And the reason that we do that is so we can copy the data and make sure that even if a whole data center goes away, there's a copy of the data somewhere else. And that requires us to send a very large amount of data back and forth that crosses international boundaries. Now, if there were rules saying you can't send data across an international boundary, if you said all of the data for this citizen has to stay in this country, two things happen. First, we can't replicate it easily, and so now it's less safe. And second, the belief that because the data is confined to one geopolitical space, it's somehow safer is probably technically wrong. The risk factors are the same no matter where you go, because everybody is on the internet and it's global in scope by design. So the vulnerabilities show up everywhere, and building a fence around the country doesn't necessarily do you a lot of good.
Yeah, I mean, come to think of it, it doesn't really make sense. You can contain the data geographically because the data are supposed to roam around the world, basically.
When the internet was designed, it was designed to be used as the basis for the American Defense Department command and control system. What that means, if you are trying to operate anywhere in the world, this system has to work everywhere. So when we did the design, we want this network of networks, why we call it the internet, to work no matter where the data is, no matter where the computers are, anywhere in the world. And so we said we will build a system where we identify the different networks not by their geopolitical location, but by their topological location in the network. And so every network has its own identifier. Each one has a name, but we don't care physically where they are. We just care how they're connected to everybody else.
I'm a political scientist and also very much interested in power. I have a firm belief that the one who gets the information has power. So having said that, it seems that the platform companies are getting more and more power. So I can see some escalation, the tensions or conflict between the private sector and the public sector, so-called government, about the data. We had some experiences like a government wants private information of the people, asks the companies to hand those the information and data over to the government. And some companies refuse to do so and other companies are more willing to do so. What is your take on this kind of issues? How much private sector should protect the consumers or customers' private information?
The position that you take in part may be a function of geopolitical boundaries that you're operating in. Not every country has the same view of protection of data. The GDPR that we talked about earlier in the European Union, of course, is a very clear statement of protection. I know certainly Google is asked for information by countries all around the world, and we try to figure out whether or not the request is reasonable. For example, does it come with a court authorization? Has some court of law said we are going to subpoena the information? Sometimes we actually push back and say that the request is too broad, that it's asking for too much information. And then, of course, we have this big debate sometimes in a legal setting in court. We also, by the way, report that, not the information, but we report statistics of the requests for information coming from many different places around the world. That's part of our transparency policy, which countries are asking for information, although we don't share the specific information. I should also mention one other interesting development in the European Union. It was called the right to be forgotten. And the idea there was that if somebody found that by searching on their name, something on a website that was hazardous for them, they could petition to Google to remove that information from the search index. And so that's a process that we do on a regular basis now. When people send in requests, if we think that they're justifiable, we will remove that information from the index in order to protect the person's information.
Recently in the United States, I heard some movements and calling for the regulations on the big techs. And it kind of actually reminds me of late 19th centuries and early 20th centuries and the oil industry. And also more recent cases, Microsoft. What do you think about this? Because all those big techs at one time, it used to be like very liberal and kind of the torchbearer of the freedom, but all of a sudden it became a big tech.
Again, obviously, I have a somewhat biased view of all this. I don't think that big is necessarily bad. Behavior counts. That's really what we want to talk about, is what kind of behavior is beneficial. And I think companies like Google are doing as much as we can to protect people's information and to be compliant when demands are made. So, solution to the problem in the 1900s, there was very little competition. They were buying everything up. I would argue that there is still quite a bit of competition in the world among the big techs. But to come back to your basic question about, is big bad? Not necessarily. In fact, sometimes big offers efficiency. What I think we are all interested in is a set of rules that will protect the consumer's interests, that will enhance competition and consumer choice. We should be focused on what benefits the consumers. Google believes in competition. I always imagine somewhere at some university, there are two guys like Sergey Brin and Larry Page in some dorm room inventing something that's better than anything we have. I'm convinced that over the span of decades, we've seen repeatedly that some big companies don't survive. So big doesn't necessarily guarantee success at all.
Who can be the competitor of Google, though? I cannot really think of any.
Actually, there are lots of competitors. If you consider for just a moment, just two businesses that we're in at Google. One of them is advertising, and the other one is cloud computing. We're a number 3 in the cloud computing business. Amazon is number 1. Number 2 is Microsoft, and Google is number 3. We're the underdog in the cloud business, but we're working very hard. I'm not persuaded Google is in any better position than anyone else.
Well, and also in Korea, the National Assembly is trying to pass the legislation, which is basically charging more money to the big platform companies like Google for using the local network. So it's called the network usage fees. I understand Google against it, but for the person like me who is ignorant about the system, without expertise, it feels like, well, because you're so popular and you're probably using a lot of space of the network, is that the reason the government is trying to charge more money? So why is the problem?
You have to go back in history to appreciate how different this view is from most of the rest of the internet. When Bob Kahn and I did this original design, we wanted any networks that wish to be part of the internet to be able to connect to it. We don't care whether you're a for-profit company or not. All we care about is that it will interoperate successfully by following the protocols that we had specified. When the original ARPANET was built, every one of the organizations that was part of the network paid a flat fee for being connected to the net. When the commercialization began, all of the internet service providers offered flat fees for access to the network at a given speed. So the fee was based on the access speed, but not on the absolute amount of traffic that you sent. And that turned out to cover all the costs. When the network began to grow, every one of them found that the interconnecting actually improved the value of each network. This was Bob Metcalfe, the inventor of Ethernet, called this the network effect. Every time two networks interconnect, everyone on all the networks is benefited by having access to the other people. And so there was no charging. Google decided that it would invest in enormous amounts of international networking capability. So we spend billions of dollars to build undersea cables and land-based networks to connect the data centers together and to connect the entire system to 8,000 or 9,000 different networks around the world. So we spend an enormous amount of money to connect locally. In the case of Korea, we connect to the Korean networks, and we pay the cost of getting all the way across the Pacific Ocean, all the way to whatever network is serving a Korean customer. So we're actually investing heavily to remove costs from what the Korean ISPs would have had to pay. So the idea that we should have to pay twice doesn't make a lot of sense. What that means is that the customers in every country, including Korea, can get access to this enormous network at no additional cost to them. They pay to get access to the Korean network, and then all the rest of the cost of getting the traffic to our data centers is borne by us, not borne by the Korean agencies at all.
So had it not been for Google, then the Korean network should have been paid for that to not just within Korea, but going across the Pacific Ocean?
Two ways for the Korean internet service providers to connect to the rest of the internet. They can build out their network and establish connections with all kinds of other networks around the world, or they can go to some of the larger network internet carriers and pay them what's called transit fees in order to be connected everywhere to the rest of the world. And in Google's case, we decided to build out the network. And so we bear all of the cost of building out the network and operating it and touching as many networks as we can all around the world. So that was our choice. This seems to me pretty obvious that once you bring the network service right to the border of the Korean network service providers, you have done them a huge favor.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next question. It's about the more delightful thing. How do you envision the world for the next generation?
I am pretty convinced that people will find that computers are, in fact, a way of augmenting their own capability. Language translation, for example, we're augmenting our weakness in not speaking all languages of the world. We can do computations now in real time because of the amount of computing power we have that you couldn't do before. So you can actually decide to do things that would have been impossible in the past because we have so much capacity to compute, to ingest huge amounts of data. So these students are on the threshold, endless opportunity, as nearly as I can tell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cerf. It's been very delightful and insightful conversation we had.
Thank you so much. And if you do come to Washington, please tell me, because I would be so happy to take you to dinner. We could have a nice chat.
Well, great. Thank you so much.